This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Welcome to the Ag Carbon Farming Podcast. My name is Scott Warr. In our last episode, we talked about how ag carbon farming and how it works. Today, we're going to break down how carbon ranching works. From understanding carbon ranching, setting a baseline to implementing new practices, and finally, earning carbon credits. We'll discuss how ranchers can choose their own path, adopt sustainable practices, and see real benefits. Joining us today are Jerry Stevens and Kelsey Miller to walk us through the journey on how carbon ranching boosts both the environment and the bottom line while connecting producers to the growing voluntary carbon market. Jerry lives in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where he's been an agronomist for over 40 years, and he's been with Agoro Carbon for 3.5 years. He covers areas of South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana, and he's responsible for contracting process with producers. Kelsey is out of Montana, and she covers Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, some of the most beautiful country. No offense there, Jerry, but Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, it's pretty amazing there. She's been working in the ag and natural resource conservation for 20 years with a focus on pasture and adaptive grazing management. Her current work focuses on aiding our producers in implementing new regenerative practices. Kelsey, Jerry, thank you for joining us on this episode to help us understand how the carbon market works with ranching. For those who are new to this, and it's their first exposure to carbon ranching, Jerry, what is carbon ranching and carbon sequestration on the ranch? How does that all work?
Well, Scott, as you know, ranchers are probably one of the original conservationists, because if they're not good at managing grass on their land, then they have nothing to feed their livestock. So we're blessed, Kelsey and I, are to work with a lot of ranchers out here. And carbon ranching, really what it has to do with is if we can help a producer through practices increase their soil health. So as an agronomist, sometimes I think of organic matter, but actually what we're going to measure is soil organic carbon. So the better we can manage forage on top of the ground and animal movement, it allows producers to have healthier soils, which adds for risk management, more water holding capacity, and all sorts of things.
Is soil organic carbon, that process of measuring that, is that something that is new to ranching, or have ranchers been doing that all along?
I think the process of measuring carbon in the soil is new. In traditional agriculture, we take a lot of soil samples, a lot of precision grid samples, all sorts of things, but most folks may have taken a few samples on their ranch. But what we do is we come in and we take a soil sample, send it to a lab, and actually use a combustion test. They burn it, if you will. It's not even a new test. So the test has been around for a long time, has been very proven, but it's actually new. This process is new to a lot of ranchers.
Kelsey, like Jerry was saying, ranchers have been the environmentalists for years, because if they're not maintaining and improving their land, they're not going to have a product that they can sell. How does Agoro work with the rancher to help them improve their soil health?
So that's my role as a support agronomist on our grower success team, is after they've signed a contract and we get them onboarded, they've usually chosen a path of these practices that they're going to implement. How they actually implement them on the ground is really wide open. So improved grazing, biodiversity, and fertilization are the 3 practices that we work with in rangelands. And once we're at the execution phase, we know that each ranch is kind of at their own place on the regenerative journey. Some people are just starting off and have a continuous grazing system, and rotational grazing is maybe new. We have some producers that have been doing rotational grazing for a long time, but they're looking to optimize that. So we come in with lots of fresh ideas, but mostly just to sit down with the producer and talk about the goals that they already have on their ranch, what practices and projects would they like to implement, and then any kind of resources and science and monitoring that I can bring to the table and just support them on the journey. That's what really makes the difference.
It sounds like these practice changes that you're suggesting to them are not big lifts for them, and you're directly implicating a better soil health. So they're easily adopted. Could you say that, or are these heavy lifts, or these big practice changes that the ranchers may be skeptical of?
No, I'd say it depends on the ranch. We have some ranchers that have really, gotten the bug for regenerative agriculture, and they want to make huge, huge sweeping changes. And sometimes they're more gradual, and we're looking for low hanging fruit. Our incentives and the additionality that we're looking for is them agreeing to some sort of new practice change, but the sky's the limit. And we have a 10-year contract length. So who knows what kind of innovations and products are going to be out there in the future. They only really need to do these initial practices in the first couple years to get started, but our relationship will really evolve per their requests and their needs. And who knows what they'll be achieving, 5 years from now.
Scott, I'm gonna kind of shamelessly steal some of Kelsey's words I've heard her use with producers. And she talks about it in the way that we meet producers where they are. And so she talked about this. Some people are quite a ways down the journey, and some people are just starting out. So our program really allows us to adapt our contracts to what that producer would like to do and what their future plans are.
I think there's two things that just popped out to me. One is you're not going in and saying, hey, if you want to participate in this program, you have to do A, B, and C. What you're going in and sitting down with the rancher and saying, let us understand what you're doing currently. You analyze that and say, okay, here are some options. What makes the most sense for you and your ranch? And they can implement those. You're not kind of confining them into a box or a canned plan. You're working with them and helping them improve their ranch according to their priorities.
Absolutely. And that change between ranches could be as simple as sometimes there's 3 generations of a ranch that your folks are working on that ranch, and they all have ideas, right?
Yeah.
From grandpa down to the grandson. And so the nice thing is as they're taking these baby steps or these incremental steps, is we can support them on that. And I will truthfully say each one of the contracts I sign is a bit different in the expectations from somebody that's never done anything regenerative wise. For them, it might just be planting some other crops or doing some more, or it could be doing some more rotational grazing. For more advanced people, it might be doing, daily moves. Some of them are really set regenerative to do more daily moves with their livestock.
And not every practice makes sense on every acre. So most of our ranches are improved grazing projects, and that's applicable on a wide spread of acres. But biodiversity seedings and fertilization might not make sense on your dry uplands, for instance. So it's really a mix and match of acres. And really, carbon credits is great incentive. It's great kind of gap financing, but the real income potential comes from soil health. So we always start the conversation with the economics, and it has to make sense, and it has to be profitable and beneficial for the environment. Carbon credits are kind of the to the side and the cherry on top.
I love that what you're doing is you're helping them improve their farm, their ranching and the ranching practices and their regenerative activities. And like you said, the carbon credits and the revenue that they're gaining from Agoro is just that cherry on top. When you meet with growers, how do they receive this? Do they know what carbon farming is, what carbon credits are? It's almost like having a discussion with me about cryptocurrency. I don't know what it is. I've heard about it. I still don't know what it is. You can't touch it. You can't feel it. Tell us a little bit more about carbon credits and carbon farming and the carbon marketplace. Jerry, you want to start, and then Kelsey, you can join in?
I think my job is kind of to demystify these carbon markets. And a lot of people think it's all about politics or things like that. And it's all about government money. And in our program, we work in the voluntary carbon market, and there is no government money involved. And so you're right. It's we talk them through that piece of it to make sure they're comfortable about who they're doing business with. And also the creation of these credits. After we create an issue of credit, who are they being sold to, or why would a company want to buy them, for example? So the conversation that we run through, we have some people that are very educated on carbon credits, and some people are starting at zero on them. These conversations will last for an hour to 3 hours sometimes with people, depending on how much interest and how many questions they have.
I have to say, even for myself, coming from a range and pasture background, the ecology of it all makes a lot of sense to me, and the economy of it was a lot different. So Jerry handles the contract side, but I like to really level it with people that this is a process that they're well aware of. Carbon is from carbohydrates. We are human beings. We love sugar and carbohydrates. We know that process well. And it's just photosynthesis from the sun to the plants, and they're taking CO2 from the air and turning it into sugars, to carbohydrates, carbon. And so it becomes their plant bodies and the exudates through their roots as they're feeding the soil. And that exchange with the soil microbiology is what brings the plants all of its nutrients and health. So that process works whether we're incentivizing it with carbon credits or not. And our practices really just optimize that ecological process of carbon sequestration.
We talked about on our previous episode that was focused more on farming, that typically, let's say a rancher raises cattle, and the cattle get to a certain age, and then they sell that to market. So they sell a physical product to someone, and they receive revenue from that. This is a little bit different paradigm, where they're creating a carbon sequestration or a carbon credit on the land, but they're not physically taking that carbon and exchanging it for money. Explain to me how you measure the carbon, and how does that turn into a carbon credit, and then how does that turn into money?
I'll start by just saying that the environmental attribute of soil organic carbon, we're not going to come pick it up. You get to keep it at the end of the day.
Right.
And that's what's increasing your water holding capacity and your nutrient exchanges with your forage. That's what is your soil health. So it's staying on your land, but that is, in a sense, what we are monetizing with a carbon credit. So after we determine what your kind of baseline scenario is, we measure the soil organic carbon in year 0 with the traditional soil combustion tests, and come back in years 5 and year 10, and we look at that progress and compare it to where we would have gone without our practices. And that difference, a carbon credit is just a 1 ton equivalent of CO2 in the soil. And I'll let Jerry take the economic side of it.
How does that turn into money for me, the rancher?
Absolutely. So Kelsey talked about the soil sampling, and I love the soil sampling because I always visit with people, tell them that the soil sample is actually the arbiter of what we pay you. Okay, so we don't just use modeling like some companies. So we will actually use the soil sampling results, and we can tell how much new carbon or performance-based program, how much new carbon you've captured out there, if you will. One fundamental difference between this program and a lot of programs in agriculture, especially in the Corn Belt in the Midwest, that I'm very well aware of, is sometimes in some programs you go through the practices and you just check the box.
Mm-hmm.
You threw the cover crop seed out there, and whether it grew or not, you got your payment, right? We're really all about making sure people spend money where it's going to make them money on their ranch. So don't go through the motions and don't do something just for the carbon program. If agronomically or soil health wise or better forage, you're not going to get an advantage out of it in the end. And so we pay a lot of attention to that this isn't just a check in the box program, that we want them to choose practices that will be valuable to them in the long run.
And we really have this shared success model. So we offer a floor price per ton of carbon that is agreed on the contract time. And then our commercial director markets those to buyers. But the grower really knows that I'm going to be rewarded for my success. And if there is no success, then there's no product for us either.
Yeah, I love it because it's almost like double dipping. They're going to see the benefits from this on the land, but then they're also going to get this carbon credit, hopefully, if the program or if the practices turn and do the things that they're supposed to. It sounds like you talked about the baseline. You have to go out and take some measurements. How disruptive or how much time is committed to this? What do I need to commit to as a rancher to get the baseline set? And then how often do I need to talk to somebody at Agoro? What's my time commitment?
So after they assign a contract and they're committed to these practices, our onboarding team helps them get their maps, and we do a 3-year look back at their history. And it's simple data stuff, planting and harvest for farmland, and for in our about our grazing plan for range and pasture, and seeding and fertilization history on those fields. And that process is pretty simple. Then we have your shape files. And then they can come into support. So that's where my team comes in. And on an annual basis, we'll just recollect that same data that we got for the baseline. And I like to visit ranches once a year or more if I can, but really I'm a phone call away. So I have some producers that, we text sometimes on a weekly basis if they're working on a project, and they know that there's really no limit. And I try to connect them with as many outside resources or other people on our team, whatever's helpful to them. So at the minimum, we're going to touch base once a year, and you'll send me a little bit of data, but we can go up from there.
Scott, one other thing I'll add is a lot of this data you could do with a cup of coffee in your hand at the table. I mean, it's like the number of cows, number of animals you have, the average age of those animals. It's going to be, one thing we'll keep track of is days in and out of pastures, but it's quite literally what's your average calving weight, what's your average calving date. And I haven't met a rancher yet that can't answer 80% of these questions, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. So
it's data they're already keeping track of, right?
Exactly. So the days in and out of pasture, and a lot of them do it all kinds of ways, everywhere from apps on their phones to making notes on the calendar, and all those work just fine. So it's not like a very heavy lift for producers even before the program or once they get into the program.
One of the great things I get to do too is I get to give data about their land back to the producers themselves. So our soil organic carbon sampling is a great information set that we can work with, but there's also a lot of free and easy access remote sensing satellite information about rangeland productivity, and those kind of things really quicken that learning feedback loop, so the producer knows that the practices that they're implementing or have implemented in the past are actually working. And it's some really robust monitoring that we can provide for them, kind of at the touch of the button these days.
The more I get to know the Agoro team of agronomists, it's almost like you're getting another advisor that's not just being a taskmaster saying, I need this data, but somebody that you can talk to. And like you said, Kelsey, you're a phone call away. If there's a simple question that may or even may not have to deal with the program, you're there to listen and to advise. I love that. Tell me this. Let's say that I'm a very progressive farmer and I've been doing some of these regenerative practices, and I decide, hey, this carbon credit thing kind of seems like an interesting thing. Maybe I'd like to dip my toe in that and gain some additional revenue for my practices. If I have been doing some of these regenerative practices and you come out and do a baseline, are there situations where you guys kind of say, you're doing everything you should be doing and that maybe this program isn't for you? Or is there still opportunity?
Well, yes. So for example, I'll talk about in the farmland, cropland program. If you're already doing cover crops and CSP or another program is paying for you to do those cover crops, I can't sign you up because you're already doing that practice. So there's a really key term called additionality, which means what new or additional practice are you going to be able to implement on your operation? So let's talk about somebody who's doing grazing, even though they're doing a fairly good job of grazing. Quite literally, one of the folks I work with in South Dakota, from his grandfather on, they've let the cows out and they've always gone around this 2,000 acre pasture clockwise. Well, he's put thermal sinks in now, and he can turn on and off their water. Now he's trained them to follow the water around these pastures. So now instead of eating early grass, on the west side of that pasture every year, now it changes over. Now it's on the east side early. So quite literally, there's all kinds of ways that producers can implement these practices.
And I have yet to meet a rancher that's ever satisfied sitting on their hands and says, well, it's
right.
going to be, right? No, they're always progressing. And in the carbon markets, we're really just trying to reduce barriers, whether it's education or financial. And help you do the best you possibly can do. That looks different on every ranch. Not everybody is going to achieve the same level of success, but some people very much do self-qualify when they think, man, I already have really healthy soil. In the West, where I work, the upper limits of carbon really are so far from being achieved that that's really not a concern. We know that there is gains to be had. And I have the coolest job in that I get to have a really great kind of friendly and scientific relationship with folks. I am absolutely not a taskmaster. And if anything, sometimes I get distracted by the science and the cool bit of it all, and I need to be put back on task. But I get to go out to these ranches and just absolutely geek out on the cool stuff that they are doing and they're want to do and bring new ideas to them. And about half the time or more, I'm the one taking notes, right? Like I have so much to learn from some of these producers. And that's part of our asset too, is that we have this network of ranchers, and some of them are just absolute pioneers and have been doing this kind of stuff long enough that I learned so much. And then I get to go to the next ranch and say, well, so and so down the road tried this, and maybe I can actually just connect you two. And so that network really works for itself to help us all do better.
I don't know if you run into this at all, but let's look at the other extreme, that maybe there's a rancher that hasn't implemented any of good regenerative practices. If they're listening to this podcast episode, and you're going out to do a baseline, should they be fearful that these baseline tests are going to reveal something that's alarming, or that you're going to be they're going to be judged because they're not doing some of the practices? How do you approach that?
Well, in a lot of the NRCS programs, there's kind of point systems. Like you're doing these things and you're getting points. So the nice thing is, I mentioned earlier, Kelsey says we meet people where they are. So some people are just starting that journey. Some of them have picked up very degraded rangeland that they're trying to rehab. So we work all across that spectrum. The soil samples, the nice thing is there's no right or wrong answer, because we're going to measure the difference at year 5, the additional carbon in year 10. If I run into anything, I run into people that self-disqualify. Oh, I'll never, I'm not going to, build fence every 100 yards and move all these cattle every day. Well, for some folks, that's not practical, right? So they kind of self-disqualify, thinking it's just an absolute intensive program. But again, it could be as intensive or not in these regenerative practices as a producer wants. We just need to show that they're implementing new practices on that operation.
And the beautiful thing is that soil health principles are very basic and they work. They work no matter which system you're in, no matter how degraded it is. And so to see people really light up when they see successes, degraded rangeland has so much potential. And when people see that they can go from nothing to producing forage and raising livestock where they've never been able to in just a few years, sometimes it's really inspiring.
Let's go back to the money. So we've turned these practices into sequestering more carbon into these carbon credits. Do I, as the rancher, need to find somebody to buy these credits? Do I get a choice on who buys these credits? And what if there are no buyers? Who's in charge of that?
Well, that's a great question, because early on in these carbon markets, there were carbon credits kind of created and issued, but there were no buyers, and as a result, the producer never got paid. That'd been 10 or 15 years ago in this area, in Montana, for example. The nice thing about our program is once the credits are issued, within 60 days of that, we need to start paying you for those credits, whether they're sold or not. We have a base price or a floor price kind of in our contract. And even if at that point in time, the market is below that floor price, you'll know exactly what a minimum price you're going to get. And also it does allow for price appreciation. So in the future, if this market really does take off, we have the ability to pay them more money on any given year.
Oh, I also think it's important to note that it's not a delivery contract. We have our estimation tool, and a producer can go look on that at agorocarbon.com, and it's our carbon calculator. And you decide on the practices, and given your county, we kind of have an idea of what kind of ton of carbon per acre we can expect. And our practices would direct that, but we if we get to the end of 5 years or 10 years and it's more or less, we pay accordingly. We're not expecting a certain amount. You're not beholden to a certain amount.
I'm curious, Kelsey, who buys these credits? Who are the buyers?
Well, as Jerry said, we haven't pre-sold any credit, and our parent company is Yara International. And they are in Europe, which is a mandatory carbon market, which is very different than the voluntary carbon market. So voluntary carbon buyers are doing it for a couple of reasons, and it's very consumer driven, right? It's for marketing, it's for finance reasons. Maybe they can get a better finance percentage, or there's investors that are only interested in kind of green and sustainable companies. So there's a real economic driver for people to be carbon neutral or reduce their carbon footprint.
I just took a flight couple weeks ago, and on my ticket it said what my carbon footprint was by taking that flight. So it is becoming more consumer aware, and I think there are companies out there most companies have some kind of a carbon aspiration that they're using to market themselves, whether those are food companies, or if you go to google.com, even on the bottom of Google, there's a little disclaimer or a little statement there you can click on and see how Google is reducing their carbon footprint. And all of them can't do it by themselves. They need to use these carbon credits to offset the carbon that they're emitting. So I think that the market's only going to get larger. Kelsey, as we close here, you mentioned something that I never really thought of. It reminded me of an article I just read by McKinsey that talked about innovation over the last 60 years. And it went through some of the things like, the internet, the cell phone, and all these different innovations. And I never thought about it until you mentioned it earlier in the podcast that currently Agoro has some practice changes that can help ranchers improve their carbon sequestration, improve soil health, improve their regenerative practices. But who knows what's going to happen next year? We may find another practice, or in 5 years, we may have another practice that can help us meet these goals as well. And I'm excited to see what's coming. Are there anything, you're at a conference right now, is there anything that catches your eye or makes you think, boy, that's going to be neat for the future?
Oh, constantly. It's really almost hard to keep up with it, right? I graduated college in 2011, and the tools that I use today weren't even invented. And
Wow.
I never thought I was going to be a carbon agronomist, right? And as we think about this, our science team evaluates new practices that we may offer on a contractual basis. But above and beyond that, even if you've already signed up, you have an older contract, or you're coming in with improved grazing or what have you, we're a pay-for-performance company. So anything that benefits soil health above and beyond or different than our practices will be kind of captured in this shared success that when we're going to measure it. So the sky's the limit. If you can beat the odds and do better than we thought, that's fantastic. But the biologicals or algae, it's constant. One of my favorite tools, like I mentioned before, is kind of this robust satellite monitoring that we can do. So the power of information that we're able to get in the hands of producers is really moving the needle.
Yeah, and Scott, one of the things I like about this program is there are practices that you have to show additionality to get involved in the program. But okay, let's talk about biologicals, and we're trying to figure out how we incorporate that in these carbon markets. But if there's one that is proven to add to your forage base or tonnage out there, and you'd like to use it, even though it's not one of our practices, we don't prohibit that. I mean, our list is pretty short. Just don't light things on fire. But it's quite simple. Anyway,
Jerry, how does someone get started? If a rancher is listening to this episode, where can they get more information, and how do they get started?
Absolutely. So if you go to agorocarbon.com, there is a calculator on there that Kelsey mentioned. But also there's a tab on there, like for our team, our contracting team, that by geography, you can find out who the local rep is, and you can call us directly. You can create an estimate yourself on there and leave your email address, and we'll get back to you. So a lot of our leads actually come from referrals from people in our program. It's probably the largest success I've had is actually from people in the program giving a referral to a friend or a neighbor.
That's a huge testament in how the program works. That's really cool. Jerry Stevens, Kelsey Miller, thank you for joining us on this episode to help us understand how the carbon marketplace works in the ranching here in North America. We really appreciate that. Again, the website is agorocarbon.com. There's a lot of information. If you're nervous talking to somebody, there's a lot of information you can get there and start educating yourself on the whole process, and then reach out. That's one of the biggest differentiators that I see with Agoro Carbon is the people. The people on your team, the agronomists that go out and talk to the farmers, they know their subject very well. They've been working in ranching or farming, and they know ranching practices. They understand what keeps you up late at night, and they're there to help. So thank you, Jerry and Kelsey, for coming on and helping us understand that a little bit better.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Yep, it's wonderful. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.